All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. And I want to start out with a thanks for somebody who eventually will be with us, but isn't with us right now, Aaron Espily, who really had the idea to put this together and bring representatives from Mongabay here to join us at CU for a couple of days. It's a great idea and a really good fit. I'm Michael Kodas. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Environmental Journalism here at CU Boulder. And I'm going to let the rest of our panelists introduce themselves. But this is a really exciting event for me personally in that I've followed Mongabay for a while. And when I did my first assignment in Indonesia a number of years ago, looking at palm oil and wildfire and peat bogs, I had no idea who I was going to connect with there and how I would find a translator and a fixer and a driver. And out of the blue, sent an email to Rhett Butler because he'd done a lot of stories that I'd read about this. And he immediately got back to me with a number of suggestions that really helped me do that work. So this is the first time that I've met him face to face. So thank you for your help and all the help that you've provided a lot of other journalists, and for the help that Mongabay provides a lot of journalists in this new model for environmental journalism, which I think is fascinating and really at a time when we have so many tragic stories about layoffs and challenges in the world of journalism. Here is, a startup with a new model that has proven to be quite successful. And so with that, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege of asking the first question. And I want to ask Rhett about how he had the idea to create Mongabay, this now very renowned environmental journalism outfit that is working around the world and read by millions of people. And did he have any idea that 20 years ago it would turn into what it is today? Is he completely surprised by what it is, or was this your plan all along?
This definitely wasn't the plan all along. I kind of stumbled into this. So this was actually born out of my childhood. So I had the great fortune of having a mother who's a travel agent and a father who traveled a lot for business. So I had a lot of miles. And so my parents prioritized travel growing up. And I always liked reptiles and amphibians. And in my view, the best reptiles and amphibians were in the rainforest. So I would lobby to go to the rainforest. And a few times my parents took me to these places. But the reality is that I had no idea that this was going to develop into this website. And so really it was born out of this passion for animals and wildlife. And when I was in college, I was trying to raise awareness by writing this book. And then instead of publishing the book, I decided to put it on the internet so people could read it for free. And of course, I wasn't going to this wasn't going to be my job. I was going to get a real job. But it turned out that people were really interested in the topic, and one thing led to another, and I started doing Mongabay as, a real job. And originally it was, me in my pajamas in my apartment, writing stories. And then that eventually led to this much bigger thing, which I didn't plan for, but is going really well. And it's been exciting to see the growth. So definitely didn't plan for it to go this way, but there's a lot of serendipity and, just opportunities arose. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, speaking as a reformed photojournalist, one of the things that drew me to Mongabay initially and why I kept going to their site is Rhett is a pretty fabulous photographer. And so if you haven't had a chance to go to their site and look at some of their visual storytelling, it's really worth going there just for that, although the stories and the investigations are really top-notch. So in the time that you have been developing Mongabay, and obviously there have been plenty of turns and twists along the way, what have been the overarching trends that you've seen in environmental journalism around the world? How has the industry and the beat of environmental journalism changed during the time that you've been creating Mongabay?
So it's changed a lot. I mean, it's kind of followed the same trajectory as we've seen with print media. So there's been a shift away from kind of the in-depth investigative reporting and a lot of the locally based reporting. So you tend to have a lot of desk reporting and less people going out to the field to do the really substantive reporting. You also see kind of more influence of kind of PR and communications coming in, and so people because newsrooms don't have resources, especially on environmental issues, they kind of will run with, PR, press releases that come in and then kind of adapt that into stories. So it seems like, in general, the quality and nuance has been trending downwards in environmental journalism. But I feel like in the last 2 years, there's been a little bit of a renaissance as the model has changed a little bit. So, newspapers have been in decline, but there's kind of this emergence of philanthropic supported journalism, which has kind of reinvigorated the space to a degree. And so, Mongabay has certainly shifted towards that, and we've been a beneficiary of the fact that philanthropists are interested in this space. So I'm maybe not as pessimistic as you would expect. So we've kind of gone, I feel like we're kind of, coming back to where high quality journalism is supported, but it tends to be more sector focused and targeted. So, the New York Times obviously is doing great reporting, but you wouldn't necessarily see like the San Francisco Chronicle or kind of newspapers like that doing this work. And so the best work either is kind of in those, the New York Times type entities, or it's kind of in the specialist outlets who really focus on these issues.
Great. And so I'm going to move on to our other panelists here in a second, but I'm going to be quite cruel and ask you to explain Mongabay without all of the visuals that you had to explain it to my class a few hours ago. Rhett and company were just visiting my reporting on the environment class. But it is an unusual model that a lot of people probably aren't that familiar with in how you fund this journalism and how you manage to cover so many issues, really in the tropics all around the world. So, how does Mongabay work?
First of all, Mongabay is a conservation news and environmental science news science website. We publish original content in English, Indonesian, and Spanish. And so we have about 50 staff now in probably about a dozen countries. And then last year we had about 450 correspondents in about 50 countries, all reporting on these various topics. Mongabay is a nonprofit, and so I've had to transition from being a journalist doing reporting to focusing more on kind of the business and operations, which includes fundraising. And so the way it works for us is about 60% of our funding comes from foundations, so philanthropic foundations. So I'm going out and pitching foundations, much as a freelance journalist would be pitching an editor at a newspaper or a magazine. And so what I do is I'll go to, we have maybe 100 topics that we want to do stories on. And so I will go out to funders, say like the Packard Foundation or something like that, and I know they're interested in climate change. So I will go to them and say, okay, well, we'll publish 300 stories over the next 3 years on palm oil, which is a major driver of land use change in Indonesia. And we'll publish them in English and Indonesian. Would you be interested in funding that? And ideally, they would say yes, and then we'll do a series on that. But we have a strict firewall between editorial and sort of the business side. So my editors and journalists won't ever be connected to the funding source. So that all stops at me or the other people who are kind of on the operations team, because we don't want to have our journalists or editors feeling like that they're being influenced by the funder. And so most funders understand this. You have to be willing to say no, though. So if I interact with somebody who doesn't really understand what we do and they want to sort of pay for placement or pick topics, then I just have to basically walk away from that, because that's we're journalism. That's not how we do things.
So you really do feel as though you've managed to maintain traditional journalistic standards and the foundations of separation of church and state, as we would call it.
Yeah, I do, because I think that's what gives us our credibility. So as soon as we're seeing it being seen as an advocacy organization or a communications organization, it kind of in a way undermines what we do a bit. Advocacy is very important, but it's not what we do. And so there are other organizations that's what they do, and this is what we do, and this is the mechanism that we have to cause change in the world. And so we don't want to mix things, because it would just hurt us, I think.
Great. So now I'm going to pick on Taran for a moment. And so, young journalist, CU grad, and you were in Colombia, right?
Yes.
And so what made you choose to pitch a story idea to Mongabay? And also, what made you want to report on the environment?
Okay. So I I had never heard of Mongabay, but I had a friend who was also a colleague of mine, a journalist, and he was telling me about a story he was doing in Panama on a dam project in an indigenous territory. And so it sounded interesting, and I kind of investigated, and I looked more into Mongabay, and then from there, the environment's always been very important to me. I started out with journalism, doing more political journalism, but the environment, growing up in Boulder, so I'm from Boulder, it's a place where it's kind of intrinsically connected in this place. Everybody has somewhat of an environmental awareness, at least. So that was part of it, and then I was in Colombia, living in Colombia, and it's such a biodiverse, incredible country. So much just natural wonders there that were very impactful for me traveling around the country. So I wanted to report on that, and then there was a story about a road that was being built through the Amazon that was actually the FARC guerrilla had built. And then with the peace deal, they wanted to come through there and formalize it. But as we know, building roads can create deforestation. And so that was part of the story, was that tension between the aim and the peace deal, which was a 2016 peace deal with the FARC guerrilla, which was supposed to help, in addition to end the war, supposed to help Colombia develop its economy. And one of the ways they wanted to do that was roads. So, but then at the same time, if you're building a bunch of new roads, there will be an environmental impact. So that was the story that I first started with Mongabay.
And we've got Rhett here. We've also got Becky, one of the editors from Mongabay, visiting with us. Do either of you remember that story? And this is not a comment on the story at all. You guys publish a lot of stories, but
I remember the original pitch, and then I remember reading the story and thinking, great, one of his pitches landed with one of my editors, and because I'm a little bit disconnected right now from when the pitch comes in, because it goes directly to editors now, but I do remember seeing the story and was glad that it happened, so yeah. But I don't think you were on the story.
Okay. So you do remember at least one of them. Yeah. Okay. So, and as a journalist in the trenches now, Taran, how do you make environmental topics? Often they're investigative. They've got a lot of science in them. They can be maybe data heavy. How do you make those compelling and lively for readers? How do you get people to pay attention to the environmental issues and stories on environmental issues that we think are really important, but maybe a little drier than the cat videos that you can click on Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge. You've got to realize that your readers got 1,000 other things they could be looking on the internet for, and you've got to catch them with a great lead that's going to get them in and make sure, okay, how do you start this with a character? How do you create the scene for people? Or if you can't start it with a character, start it with why it's important, and you just go from there. It's similar to all journalism endeavors, I think, but it does add an extra challenge. The environment, in that it's very important, but some people don't. It's hard to get people to care. So.
And so I want to move on to Chris here, who's a new writer for Mongabay, and I still don't think that we have put this story up to embarrass you, but I think your first story for Mongabay just launched within the last 2 or 3 hours, right?
Yes, still settling. Just got to pull out the oven. Let it simmer.
Chris is one of this year's Scripps Fellows in Environmental Journalism. This is a terrific program here at the University of Colorado where we have 5 mid-career environmental journalists who spend a year at the university learning about the environment and science and things like that. It's how I came to see you, and we've got a number of current and former Scripps Fellows in environmental journalism in the audience here. But Chris was a producer from CNN in a past life. How was your experience working in kind of this new model for environmental journalism? I mean, this is different than kind of particularly legacy broadcast media like CNN.
Right. Well, to pointedly ask your question, it wasn't too much different in terms of the mechanics of telling a story. It's the trappings of kind of freelance versus corporate media. I think that's the one thing that's the dichotomy in my mind, if there's any dichotomy.
So it's the difference for you is being a freelancer as opposed to being a staff journalist.
Yes. Whereas you have everything supplied to you. You have to go and make those connections yourself that help you, get a camera, here at the lovely vault right in the armory. I don't know if am I going out here? We're good? Should I pull it up a little closer? Okay. So, had to source all my material from the top to the bottom, and including fixer, translator, and and driver. That proved to be a big help in the story, getting around. But the mechanics of telling a story, I've told stories on digital platforms before. It's not very new to me. I like to say I came up in the world of journalism that was pretty much all digital. I was the first, they called me a student web reporter at WFMY News 2 in Greensboro, North Carolina. So that was in 2006, and we were still calling the internet the web. And so I've seen a little bit of the change in that regard, but working for this outlet has been a breath of fresh air as a journalist, because when you have the opportunity to think about stories on a global scale and then you can't pitch them, it's like you have a baby that you can't give birth to. I'm not a woman, and I don't claim to know the pains that it takes to bring life, but I do know the creative process, and I do recognize patterns as a journalist. So the patterns that I see are in that creative process. And as you are able to manifest this pitch into an actual story, it is a remarkable thing. And I am just thankful that my first international correspondence was with Mongabay. I was primarily a domestic producer for CNN. However, I did report in Texas very heavily, which can seem like another country at times. It has its own electric grid and can break away very easily from an operational standpoint if they needed to. So it was definitely a breath of fresh air working on this side of things.
So give us the quick 30-second Hollywood trailer about what your story's about and where you went.
Okay, yeah. So quick, everybody uses firewood, right? Yes. And in this part of the world where I was working, which is Ethiopia, more than 90% of the households use firewood every day. We may use it for a season, for a night, romantic evening, perhaps, but they have to use it to live. They have to use it to eat. They have to use it to cook, clean, and anything else you want to heat up in your house, it's going to be heated up by firewood or by what they call livestock residue. You can think of what that means, all right? And this story was one that was really almost, I would say our editor, Genevieve, shout out to Genevieve Bellmaker, she is my editor who was working with me at Mongabay. Came to me, and we both kind of ran through different topics, and place was established, where Ethiopia, what topics, and it came to these women in Entoto. This is not 30 seconds. I'm sorry, I don't know why you asked me to say 30 seconds. But these women in Entoto carry wood up to 200 pounds on their back to supply the city of Addis Ababa its firewood for the day. And so you have thousands of women, possibly up to 200,000 women, estimates say, but that are carrying this wood on their backs to get it to people to just cook every day. It was a remarkable story because the eucalyptus is the wood that's primarily used as this firewood. Eucalyptus is native to Australia, not to Africa, and this wood has done a number on the water table in Ethiopia. So whereas here in Boulder, we have a beautiful bioservice provided by the Rocky Mountains that bring us water. We like to fight over it. We like to drink it, right? But their water table is being sucked up on those mountains because there have been large plantations of eucalyptus for 40 plus 100 years. All right? And so that's one of the main problems, that these women who carry this wood are kind of caught in the middle as the victims and the cause of this environmental kind of man-made disaster.
And you can find that on Mongabay today.
Yeah.
So getting back to Rhett, so you've seen your organization and you in your pajamas writing about things that you thought were important, to having a large staff and a lot of freelancers pitching you. And I'll keep mentioning this throughout, that anybody here, but particularly students that want to reach out to Mongabay, you should. It's a great place to get published. They're always looking for good story ideas. So what are you seeing as the environmental issues that need more coverage or aren't getting any coverage at all? Mongabay, if you go to their website, you can find lot of reporting initiatives, things that they are focused on, sometimes as specific as Asian rhinoceros, and sometimes as broad as oceans, that they are looking for pitches on and stories on. What do you see as the environmental issues that really need coverage right now?
Well, I think there's still a disconnect between land use change and climate. So, I mean, at Mongabay, it seems like we cover it too much, but if we look at sort of mainstream media, a lot of people don't understand the impact deforestation has on climate, but also on biodiversity. So I feel like biodiversity has kind of played second fiddle a bit to the focus on climate of late. But the reality is that we are in the midst of this sixth grade extinction. And it's much more difficult to reverse extinction than it is to address other environmental problems. So I feel like we're going to see a lot more momentum this year going into the next big negotiation on biodiversity conservation, which is in China. But it's still an issue that's not very well understood. I think oceans generally, I mean, you hear a lot about plastic right now, but plastic is, just one of many ocean issues. So everything from overfishing to the impact of carbon emissions with ocean acidification is also big. So I would say that those are areas that aren't necessarily that well understood by the general public. Also, threats to environmental defenders. So all over the world, you have people, journalists, indigenous peoples, people who work for NGOs who are getting threatened or killed almost on a daily basis for just trying to protect the planet. And in some countries, this is getting worse. If you look at places like Brazil, Cambodia, Myanmar, the Philippines, this is a real problem, and it's not appreciated. So, you have these people who are working hard to protect these lands and these habitats, and that's really hard work to begin with. But then they're actively being targeted by governments and companies. So, I think that's also a really important issue where it's kind of an intersection of human rights and environmental justice and environmental issues. So I would call out those areas as places in need of more coverage.
Yeah, and I'll point out that we have a former Scripps Fellow here who I believe has written for you about the increase in murders and attacks on environmentalists globally. And I'd like to follow that up with another question, kind of looking at what's come out of our government here, without naming too many names and getting too specific, but we've had a definite and distinct change of tone towards journalists in this country, with language like "enemy of the people" and fake news. Are you seeing a response to that in other countries or around the world in the way that journalists are treated by other governments?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, especially in places like Brazil and the Philippines, which have started using the term fake news to basically target journalists. So, I mean, the new president of Brazil and the president of the Philippines have basically declared open season on journalists and environmental advocates. So, it's pretty terrifying. We've had, I mean, we've done a lot of reporting on this issue. So it's so that's one aspect of this. But another thing, I mean, so Mongabay doesn't do as much coverage on domestic issues. When I started Mongabay, I wanted to see I wanted to focus on where we get the highest marginal impact. And so I was looking for places which had the highest biodiversity and the highest threat. And so the United States was, I mean, the United States has a lot of biodiversity, but it wasn't necessarily under a high degree of threat. I mean, I think that's changing a little bit now, but it's still compared to like Madagascar or something, it's a different equation. But the things that we do here in the U.S. In terms of statements and policies do have knock-on effects overseas. So, for example, the trade war basically made American soy not attractive to China. So, that's bad for farmers here. But the other thing it did was it's driven up soy demand in Brazil and Bolivia. So there's now large-scale deforestation happening in both those countries to produce more soy. Those contracts that are being signed right now are long-term contracts. So that's locking in supply for 5 or 10 years. So that's not going to easily reverse. And so I was in Bolivia, I guess, a month and a half ago, and there's just like large-scale deforestation right now going on, like in front of my eyes for this soy production. So that's a U.S. policy that's having knock-on effects overseas. You also see things like statements about climate change or about endangered species not being important. And a lot of countries look to the U.S. for leadership. So, they model their endangered species policies off what we do, or their climate policies, or things like that. And if we're taking these positions, it's going to have effects in those countries as well.
So I'm going to bring it back over here to Chris, but I'd like all of you to kind of answer this question, which is very often in the journalism realm, kind of across the board, but maybe more in environmental journalism than just about anywhere else, we have this accusation of being advocates or activists, and the claim that our work is biased by our points of view in that. Now, certainly at one level, I think this idea of being an advocate, well, there are some things I'm pretty proud to be an advocate for as a journalist. I'm an advocate for the First Amendment, and I believe in being an advocate for transparency in government. And I don't think that those are horrible things for a journalist to be advocating for, but sometimes it's a bit of a fine line. And so starting with you, Chris, how do you keep an eye out for the difference between the advocacy that we should be embracing as journalists and the activism and advocacy that could be biasing our coverage? And how often, how do you deal with that? How often do you have to confront that?
Right. I would say it's a constant. You have to always check your bias at whatever story you're working on, and in the environment specifically, I think it's important that journalists still do their job as journalists, still suss out the facts, still put the pressure on all of your sources that you would in any other instance outside of that story. However, I think it's important for us to be cognizant enough, like Brett pointed out, and see where the discrepancies are in the coverage, where the gaps are in the coverage, and in a way, find the people who are addressing those gaps that aren't being covered, and somewhat give them a voice, or give them a chance to speak or respond, or even raise the issue of a topic that we may not have seen much coverage on. So for me, I think our job is to cover advocates as opposed to be advocates ourselves, because even you've seen like World Wildlife Federation, for instance, you mentioned earlier in the class how some of their dealings can, have been questioned in the past. Well, there are instances where big media outlets, little media outlets who don't either have the interest or the budget to cover environmental news will just take a press release from an organization that seems to be credible and has had their name out in the public for a long time, but may have some unsavory characters doing some unsavory things behind the scenes, and then you get misinformation out there, or you end up getting biased information. Okay, this is better? I'm sorry, guys. Thank you. You get misinformation or biased information if you don't go behind that source or go behind that PR statement or go behind that that kind of provided video. Especially in the world of video and digital media, it's very easy for these smaller outlets to get tricked into just publishing a piece of video that was handout video as their own, or as fact, or as if they shot it themselves, even in some cases. And the organization will give it to you that looks nice and pretty and crisp, and you want that video, but you have to figure out, hey, how is this video sourced? Who's behind the making of the statements that are going along with this video? Who are the investors in this organization? Those are the jobs of these organizations that are going to publish that kind of material. But you have to, again, just like anything else, you have to look at it with a hard eye before you say, yes, I'm going to put this in my story, or no, I'm not going to put this in my story for this reason, that reason, and this reason, or I just won't even cover that character. Or if I cover them, I'll cover them as the sleazeball they may be.
Yeah, we love sleazeballs in this business. So Taran, working in Colombia, you were in a place that's somewhat polarized. Was this accusation of activism or advocacy, was that something that you had to deal with when you were working as a journalist there, and how did you deal with that?
To a degree, I mean, I think the way you deal with it by, obviously with journalism, you have to work with narratives, and we are creating narratives, and there's a reason that you're working on the story you're working on normally. And there is a narrative that you're trying to build. But at the same time, you can't let your narrative, if it's wrong, and you need, or if something doesn't fit with it, you also have to be accepting of that. So that's just talking with a lot of sources and trying to get around, like you just try to talk to as many people as you can for whatever story you're working on. I mean, obviously, you can't talk to every single person who's going to be involved with the story, but as much as you can, you try to get a diverse number of voices. And you can, but you also have to assess each individual source and say, okay, what's kind of going on there? Like, is this a trustworthy source? Is this like, would they have a reason to lie to me? Like, because some people do. So that's what it is. And I mean, I don't get too worried about, like, am I biased? Obviously, I'm biased in that I believe in conserving tropical rainforests. I believe in human rights. Like, I'm biased in those things. So yeah, but yeah, I think that there's certain biases that we can accept, and certain biases that, yeah, there's other ones that maybe you can be questioning. So, yeah.
And Rhett, in the big picture, you probably confront this more than everybody else, since Mongabay is kind of your baby, and you're working all over the world on all kinds of issues. How do you deal with this, accusation of bias or activism or advocacy?
Yeah, so I prefer to, I don't really like to tell people what to think. I'd rather present facts and let them make up their own decision. So I actually don't face this charge that much. There are other issues I deal with a lot more, so I wouldn't say it's a problem. But where I have seen it quite a bit is in, say, like Malaysia, from the palm oil sector. Will often level those charges. And what they'll do is they'll take like a very radical environmental group that may be less focused on facts and more focused on emotion and drama. So, and they'll single them out and they'll sort of say, all the NGOs, the scientists, and the journalists are on that side. So see, there's that one fact that kind of radical NGO got wrong, and that's all you guys. And so you're like all on this side. And so they essentially eliminate the middle. And so it's a tactic that works really well from kind of these lobby groups. And so I would rather avoid that by just presenting facts that anyone can sort of look at and see where they're coming from, so there's some transparency. That said, narrative is also very important because that's how you really win people over. So you need to have facts supporting that narrative. But yeah, I mean, my view is that Mongabay's kind of role in the advocacy space is just by the topics that we cover. So by shining a light on certain issues that other people are ignoring, that just brings a lot more attention. And so that provides a mechanism for advocacy groups to then to go with that and run. I mean, so I could talk about the story from Peru with this cacao company, if it's relevant.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
I mean, so this is kind of an example of how Mongabay works. So back in 2014, there was a company that went public in London, and it was a cacao company. And back then, the commodity markets were collapsing except for cacao. And so this company was the only pure play publicly listed cacao company. So the stock did really well. And they had this great story. They were producing cacao in a sustainable way, working with indigenous people, and it was all wonderful. We were monitoring forests globally using this platform called Global Forest Watch, which uses satellite data. And we saw these pink areas pop, which represent deforestation popping up in the Peruvian Amazon. And so we started digging into it, and it turned out that it was that company that was actually clearing primary old-growth forest in the Peruvian Amazon for this sustainable cacao. And so we started to dig into that story. We sent a journalist there. A friend of mine had actually mapped this using a very advanced airplane, which can map tree species structurally using lasers and by species. So we had actually mapped this whole area before it was deforested. So as we were doing our research, we had all the data showing how much carbon had been released, how many trees had been cut down, all this stuff. And so our journalist went and did this reporting. It turned out there was indigenous conflict and a bunch of other stuff, and the company had basically been misleading the public and investors. And so as we prepared to publish this story, we got a letter from the law firm representing the company saying that they were going to sue us into oblivion. And I went back to the law firm and I said, well, here's all the data. You can't get us for slander. You can't get us for defamation. So first of all, you have no case. Second of all, I've read your corporate social sustainability policy, and this violates it. So that's a problem for you. And you champion yourself as a free speech law firm. That's what you've been known as. And this is a top 10 law firm in the U.S. So you violate that as well. So we're publishing the story. Do what you want. So we published the story. The law firm dropped the company as a client, and a bunch of advocacy groups then started campaigns around this issue. So they started digging into it. Indigenous people were brought in, interviewed, and there were protests in Iquitos, and it became a major issue to the extent that the Peruvian government then launched an investigation and then revoked the permits, which were obtained illegally. So fast forward to January 2017, the company was delisted from the London Stock Exchange. Now, the reason that's important is they were trying to raise capital to clear another 100,000 hectares for oil palm plantations. Because it turned out this company was part of a conglomerate that was listed in the Cayman Islands. And there were 12 other companies that were, and 11 of them were doing oil palm. And so they were going to clear these 100,000 hectares. And so by virtue of this story coming out and then the advocacy that was done around the story by NGOs, advocacy NGOs, not Mongabay, that 100,000 hectares of forest was not cleared. That represents 29 million tons of 29 million tons of CO2, which is equivalent to driving a passenger car 72 billion miles. So it's a real impact that the journalism combined with this separate advocacy has. And so that's the kind of stuff that we look for at Mongabay. I mean, that's a really strong example, but it just shows the power of this kind of work.
Great. So, similar thought. Is there any foundation, organization, funder who you have turned down, either because you didn't like their overall mission, or maybe they were trying to push you into something that you didn't think was something that you wanted to cover?
Yes, I was in Singapore 3 weeks ago, and I turned down 2 funders who were linked to shady entities, and I just don't have anything to do with them. In the natural resources sector, they were the families, so it could have been innocuous, but I just was not something I want to be involved with. So I'm not going to take their money, and I've turned down a major U.S. institutional foundation, who wanted to have influence on our journalism and just didn't understand the line. So I just said I couldn't work with them.
Is that fairly common that you end up turning
No,
down
it's
funders?
unusual. No, so maybe it's selection bias, but the funders that I approach, because we are approaching foundations, we're rarely getting approached by foundations. I'm choosing ones that I think we can work with. So I can't say that that's representative of all foundations, but the ones that I tend to approach or work with are ones that kind of understand what journalism is versus like PR communications or other stuff.
Right. So, another question, and this is another one I'd like to kind of go down the line of panelists. We've talked a lot about environmental journalism, environmentalists on one side, and the bad guys on the other side. But the environmental movement and environmental issues are far from homogenous or in agreement. What are some of the fracture lines and the issues within environmental movements that merit more coverage and investigation by journalists? Where can we be giving more scrutiny on the organizations that we often are lauding or looking to work with? I'll toss it your way first.
I was going to let him go first. But.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
You're on.
Coming from my background in TV, digital, mostly TV, say like 75-25, the fight for environmental news is it's like a battle of one, I feel like, in some ways. But my battle was internally for airtime. So I'm given 12 hours in the day to try to get a 2-minute, 3-minute, maybe 6-10-minute piece in. And so I had to find like the craziest stories to break through. And so it wasn't a matter of like which segment of the environmental coverage what mattered most or was not taken up or not taken. There was no segment. It was all Trump at that point. Excuse me, guys. It was all Trump at that point on our broadcast network. And to break through was not something that was easy. And so I had to be able to take a very, I guess, top-down approach to the stories that we were covering and environmentally. And so it ended up being just like fracking, because that's crazy, and air pollution, because you can buy bottled water, but you can't bottle your air, And so that's kind of how I sold it and was able to break through. That's part of the reason why I came to this fellowship, was to be able to build the subject matter expertise around not only the oceans, but the atmosphere and the forests as well, as I found out since I've been out here. And now I can go back to organizations like Mongabay and like the other outlets that are covering specifically the environment, to be able to take on some of the issues that aren't being covered, because we're all grabbing for airtime in my world.
So, Taran, are there fault lines, conflicts, factions within environmental movements or the environmental movement writ large that merit more investigation?
I think the BuzzFeed art investigation that came out was somewhat of a fracture line between conservation and indigenous rights that could be looked at. I don't know how widespread that is, but I think there are. I think that, but yeah, I mean, within the environmental movements, some people have different ways they want to. Some people, there's also the animal rights versus for example, in Colombia, there's a story about the hippos. You probably heard it because the mainstream media loves to put it on every 6 months. But they'll replay it. But there's a people who say the hippos. So Pablo Escobar had the hippos, and they got out of his farm, and they are now living wildly in Colombia. So it's kind of a cool story that you probably see on the BBC and whatever. But some people say they should kill the hippos, and then some people say they should let the hippos be. So that's kind of a fault line that's interesting because the hippos are an invasive species. So for the forest or the natural ecosystem that they're in, they're probably not helping. But then there's some people who would say, well, they're animals and we need to protect them. So that was kind of an interesting fault line, I guess.
Yeah. And Rhett?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the human rights is the big one. It's a huge fault line in conservation. You have, on one hand, you have hundreds of park rangers being killed every year. On the other hand, you have park rangers who are committing, human rights abuses against local people. This has been a problem in conservation for a long time, but it's getting more attention now. The animal welfare issue is big. So, in Borneo, you have a lot of money being spent on captive orangutans because their habitat's being destroyed. But that's expensive. But if you put that money towards conserving habitat, then you could serve more in the wild. So it's kind of like, you want to save the cute baby orangutans, but if you're looking at scarce dollars, then is it spent more effectively doing something else? Then on the effectiveness side, there's not very much accountability or learning in conservation. So there's very little work on understanding what actually works and doesn't work in conservation. So things are done because of gut feelings, or this is how we've gotten funding for, so we're going to do it. But there's not much evaluation going on. So trying to determine what works and what doesn't work in conservation is a huge gap, and I think a significant fault line. Working with companies or not working with companies. So there's certain NGOs that team up with big companies, and there's a debate over how effective that is. Is it just greenwashing, or are these big companies actually changing? So a lot of the really big NGOs are kind of known for this. So I think those are four, but I mean, there's a lot more, and I can't think of it at the moment.
Sure.
But yeah, so there's a lot of nuance in these issues, and I think most journalism doesn't cover them in enough depth to really understand what the issues are. Oh, I guess one more would be like land sparing versus land saving. So the idea is if we all do organic agriculture, so some people argue that's great. Other people will say we can't feed the planet with that because the productivity is lower. So what we should do really intense agriculture in smaller areas. So like in the Amazon, cattle, you have maybe one cow per hectare, which is 2.5 acres. But it's all grass-fed, but the problem is you have extensification of deforestation then, because you clear a much larger area. Whereas in the U.S. we have factory farms, so those look terrible. They're bad for cows and everything, but it's a different thing. And so you can say, well, we have these factory farms, but we can preserve these areas. And so there's a lot of tension over issues like that, and it's not an easy answer. Like I can't tell you which is better, but it's a debate.
Right. So, and another thing that you've dealt with a lot is kind of these regular narratives. The fallback in class earlier we talked about the myriad stories that could be done on palm oil. Huge topic with lots to investigate, and yet you always see the palm oil and orangutan story over and over and over again. What are some of the fallback narratives that we see in environmental journalism that maybe we should be avoiding? Maybe we should be looking for more nuance or looking for new angles on.
That is a good question. Do you want to start with somebody else?
Somebody want to fall on this grenade?
Sure. I would say, again, looking at any mainstream coverage, because, again, that's kind of the world that I come from, it's too much disaster coverage, and disaster bounce pieces. You end up having a big natural disaster, Exxon, BP, we got to care about this or that. What's the other one? The Fukushima Daiichi in Japan, when that plant went down, oh no, we need to review nuclear. Like, we should have been reviewing nuclear for a long time by now. Like, you can't just pop a nuclear plant in and forget about it for 50 years. you know? And then that's really what got me interested in the oceans, was how all these worlds collide at the coast, you know? And we put our resources, our most valuable, precious energy resources, near water, which is another valuable, precious energy resource. And it's it's mind-boggling. Every time these disasters happen, you see these same narratives. We're like, oh, the shrimp, their shells are going to be thin this season because they've been eating oil or dispersants. Didn't we figure out how to clean up an oil spill already? We've had enough of them.
Taran, you find any problematic fallback narratives that that we need to get beyond?
I kind of wish there were more fallback narratives, that there was more environmental narratives in the mainstream media.
The disaster.
Yeah, except for the disasters. But even sometimes we could probably pay more attention to some of the disasters.
Of course, in different ways, yeah.
But yeah, I think maybe one that always falling back on climate change, but there's a biodiversity crisis that's happening as well.
So I thought of one. I think the view that the West is always best. So in a lot of places, there's actually a lot of innovation is coming from other countries. So it's not like the U.S. has leadership. It's actually leadership that's coming from, people say bottom up. So, indigenous people have pioneered, they've managed these ecosystems for, generations. And, they're some of the best protected places on Earth. And so I think there's an issue where people fall back and they say like, oh, the U.S. is going to come in and save something, or like a Westerner is going to move to Borneo and be the great savior of something. But the reality is we overlook some of the indigenous local solutions to these problems and don't recognize that the people who live in these areas are, a key part, if not the solution to these challenges.
And Taran brought up something. We mentioned biodiversity, but how about just diversity overall? Are we seeing a diversity problem in environmental journalism? I mean, often we see and we talked about this earlier. Kind of the great white hope narrative. The West is going to come in and solve this problem. It's a problem in Southeast Asia, or it's a problem in Africa, and it's somebody from the United States that's going to come in and solve this problem for them, when it may be something that they've got their own ideas about or have been making headway on themselves. Are you all seeing kind of a diversity problem in both environmental movements and environmental journalism about movements? Let's start out with Taran on this one.
Okay. Yeah, I would say there is a bit of a diversity problem in journalism, environmental journalism, and environmental movements, possibly. Although I think we need to get more voices speaking from more different communities. I think Mongabay does do a good job of like starting environmental publications in Indonesia is a way to be like, okay, that's a way to make more diverse storytelling, which I think is important. So that's kind of the step in the right direction. But I think it's also that with journalism, working as a journalist is hard, and it's sometimes, well, not hard, it's kind of prohibitive sometimes, because you need some support if you have a high amount of debt and you've got like a lot of economic issues. It's probably not the easiest thing to get into. So there needs to be better jobs for journalists. So that's a problem, but that's something that we need to work on, because I mean, the people who are really going to get impacted by these environmental stories should be the ones telling it optimally. But so that's what I'd say.
So I can ask questions all night, but I would like to open this up to the audience. If folks out there have some questions that they'd like to ask, I'm happy to bring you a mic. And we'll start back here, and you two can just go one right after the other. We'll start here.
Thanks, I'm Susan. I'm curious, Rhett. So how do you make the business model sustainable for Mongabay, and do you feel it's sustainable for writers, per your comment? Taran, is that your name?
So Mongabay's been growing very rapidly. So we've only been, I mean, beyond a guy in his pajamas in his apartment, operating as a real entity since 2012. But we've been growing very rapidly. So our first, I think our first year was 2012. We were like $80,000 in budget, and this year I think we're $4 million. So part of that is I basically have allocated my time to 20% of my time to fundraising and don't do writing anymore. And so, so far, it seems to be pretty good in terms of interest in what we're doing. And I think one reason why is because we're very focused on impact. So we offer, we're basically trying to deliver a lot of value. So we're collecting, obviously, readership data, but also, the impact data, like that story I told about the company in Peru. So I feel pretty good that we're on a good path. That said, I am working very hard to diversify. So when we first started, we were 100% dependent on foundations, and now we're 60%. My guess is next year we'll be below 60%. So the other channels are individual donors, and we have a new offering that's very tiny right now, but may become something someday, and that's subscription content. But we don't want to put any of our news or analysis behind a paywall. So what it is it's kind of the story behind the journalism. So like when when our correspondents go out to the field, what happened? So they got lost in the forest, or they got malaria, or whatever. So that kind of thing. So it's more of like a community, and the idea is that maybe people will pay $6 a month to be members of that. And so again, that's a diversification strategy. So I'm pretty optimistic on our that what we're building will be sustainable, or is sustainable now. But part of it's based on experimentation and trying out different things. In terms of sustainability for correspondence, I think I would be best to defer to my colleagues, but I will say it is variable depending on the country.
I just what do you pay, and how do you feel that's sustainable for writers?
Well, so
Because some of it comes from the foundations, and some comes from directly you guys, right?
no, it all comes from us. So all the money comes into Mongabay, and then we pay the journalists. Because we would never have a foundation paying the journalists directly, because that would be conflict of interest, and it would also breach the.
Yeah, I meant more like the High Country News model, where some of the funding for the journalists is through a foundation, not directly from the foundation. But anyway, yeah, a little more about the pay.
Okay, so journalists are paid on so we have staff writers, but then the freelance journalists are paid on a per story basis. So it may be per word, or maybe for a package of stories. And then we also give grants for travel. So it depends on the market. So some journalists will write, like in Indonesia, will write a story or two for us a month, and that's basically what they do for their living. Other people will be writing regularly for a newspaper and then moonlighting for Mongabay. But that's Indonesia. But I think every market's different. So I think you guys would be able to talk more to that. But at Mongabay, we pride ourselves on being very transparent about what we're paying our journalists, and paying them on time, which is something that's not necessarily standard in the journalism industry. So we've been told that we're very good in terms of being responsible for paying our journalists, whereas other outlets may wait a year to pay someone, which especially if there's expenses incurred, that's pretty hard, I think. But right. You guys could probably speak better.
Yeah, I think Mongabay does offer, especially in comparison to the other publications, where like sometimes they'll offer like $100. A lot of these mainstream media companies for an article, or $200, and it's like I wrote an article for Christian Science Monitor and spent like 3 weeks and got $350 in the end, and it was kind of like I don't know. There's not really a sustainable model. But then I think Mongabay does do a better job of at least building the trust, and kind of like helping to get the steady payment. The payment's pretty fair, especially if you're working in another country. It's actually really good. So
yeah, I would echo what they both said.
Okay, so I have a question about kind of psychology. I've been writing about the environment for 15 years, pretty much exclusively, and things definitely, at least now, particularly now, seem to be worse than they were when I started. I'm sure the same is probably true for you. And obviously, there are moments like that Peru story sounds like this kind of incredibly satisfying victory that you can feel really good about. But a lot of the stuff, you've got reporters and editors who are just dealing with this kind of relentless onslaught of bad news. So I'm wondering how you deal with that.
I became a yoga instructor on the side.
Yeah, I do Tai Chi and Qigong.
Well, so I think I'm cursed by being an optimist. So it's hard for me because I usually see. I mean, it's hard for me to sort of get, not hard, but I think I come from a different perspective on things because I tend to look for like the upside or like what's the opportunity here, which is different from most people. So I'm probably a really bad person to ask because I don't have that same perspective. But I also do get exercise and like to be outside.
Yes.
So I think there are studies that have shown that being outside is good for mental health, and so I certainly feel better after I've been
It's
outside.
like we're balancing out. So we're doing stories outside on traumatic things, and then we're like at a stasis, No, but it definitely matters. It definitely matters, the psychology of it. And for me, I think that was what I was trying to get at with my very crude metaphor of pregnancy and the creative process. Is that you have these ideas and these stories, and these things are going on. They're backed up by facts. That's why you're a journalist, And then you don't find an outlet that you can report it at, or you can report it within, and it gives it the voice that it needs or it deserves. That is a frustrating thing. It's like a hamstrung superhero, I don't know how to say it. I can't dig any further other than it's really frustrating when you can't produce it. And so sometimes when you can, even if it's for Christian Science Monitor, you're happy because you're like, and they know that sometimes. So that can be very easily, it's got to toe that line. You got to toe that line of are you doing this? How much of this labor of love is, you can't take love to the bank.
Hi there. My name is Doug, and I have a question. I have a question about the role of technology. Thinking about the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers and ICIJ's work with so many different entities and the need for remote communication software and secure connections and just all that kind of stuff, and then also the role of data journalism, a specific job function to deal with Python and SQL and Linkurious and Neo4j and graphic databases and all that kind of stuff, and then also off on a little tangent, but the potential role of contributing some of your knowledge to Wikipedia and not realizing to stay away from conflict of interest, but still share valuable new information that you've discovered with the world. So I'm just wondering what you think about all those different angles of technology in your job.
Yeah, I mean, so the Panama Papers and those other document releases are really important for journalism. We have Mongabay. I would say data journalism hasn't been our strong point in terms of digging through big databases and pulling stuff out. But we have done reporting on that, and it is something that we are working. It is on our wish list in terms of hiring I hate the term data scientist, but I'll say it here, data scientist, because all scientists use data, right? But a data scientist to be part of the team to really expand our capacity. But we have done quite a bit of reporting using those sources. So Becky actually worked on a story on Madagascar, trafficking, money laundering, shrimp trawling profits through the Caribbean, I guess. Well, anyway, offshoring. And there's a lot of this in Indonesia as well that we're digging into using I can't really say what data sources, but data sources in Indonesia to look at money laundering and moving money overseas and sort of the beneficial ownership and things like that of these companies. So you'll find out that someone who makes $10 a month owns a $1 billion company. So it seems a little strange, but there's a lot of instances of this in Indonesia. So that answers, I think, 1 and 2 of what you asked. On the Wikipedia front, yeah, I mean, I would love to put more stuff on Wikipedia, but it's kind of a bandwidth issue. Like, we already have too many things that we can't cover now, and so having a staffer who is just charged with updating Wikipedia, I think it would be a great public service. But right now, we're just mostly investing in, creating these stories. I should also add that all of Mongabay's content is produced under an Open Creative Commons license, which means it can be used by anyone for free, commercially or non-commercially. So there are hundreds of outlets that are using Mongabay stories. So while our direct readership is only like 4 million views a month or 4 million users a month, our readership beyond our website is actually much larger. So for example, we're syndicated by the largest English language newswire in India. So that means our stories are going out to, I don't know how many publications, but newspapers all over India. And then in Latin America, we've got like 25 newspapers publishing our content. So I was in Bolivia a few weeks ago and opened the newspaper in Santa Cruz, which is the commercial center of Bolivia, and there's a Mongabay story in the middle of the main newspaper. So we do extend our reach beyond that. And I would love to do more on Wikipedia, but it is really a bandwidth issue. Do you guys use do data journalism much in your reporting?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I can answer.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So, yes, I've done deep dives in EPA data. I've done deep dives in kind of company provided data. This is mostly in my time as a researcher and producer at CNN. And over that time, I was charged with vetting content from primetime documentaries to town halls. So if we had a town hall about guns, for instance, I had to go deep into that. But my specialization with data and data sets comes from a need to know. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert in any of these things, but I probably can do more than the average on getting a big hunk of data that's related to a topic and finding the narrative in that data.
Oh, yeah. As far as like securing channels of conversation and communication is an important thing. Using I used a VPN and things like that. I mean, I could probably. It's something that I would like to learn more about and continue to do. I also, when I do reporting in Colombia, sometimes I'd have multiple SIM cards, so I just have various SIM cards that I'd have, so it wouldn't necessarily be as easy to trace. But that was, there's something you do think about, especially with sensitive stories.
I should add that we do use a lot of satellite data, so using various platforms for aggregating that data and analyzing it in our reporting. So that's very significant for Mongabay, and that's kind of how that United Cacao story emerged.
And Mongabay has helped with data, adding data into my stories with Global Forest Watch and kind of helping to give that the data, which really helps.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit more about your decision-making process with coming up with your stories. For example, in my head, there's a few different types of impact. Maybe in the Peruvian example you were talking about, if local NGOs are responding, then that's a very localized impact. But maybe it's a little bit less generalizable. Maybe the normal everyday reader might not find that as interesting. When maybe the land sparing example, it's more generalizable. You can think about it in terms of the United States compared with Brazil, but perhaps there's less actionable impact on the ground. So I'm wondering if there is a dichotomy between those two types of stories and how you go about balancing that, if there is or if there isn't.
So I would generally say that impact isn't a major factor in the stories we choose. I see it as being, I mean, I'm not commissioning stories much myself now, but I mean, I think this is more of a question for you. I'm always interested in seeing impact, but I don't guide based on impact. I mean, I'll see topics which are not well covered, and so by virtue of having more coverage, that can lead to impact.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a direct line you could ever say, I'm going to write this story and I do X, this is going to happen. You'll never know. But yeah, it's mostly about things, coverage that you feel that is getting skipped over, and you want to put a spotlight in somewhere where it's kind of a dark corner that this is important, but nobody's looking at it. So,
Rhett?
I would just say I echo what they say. I just look for stories that have an interesting narrative, strong characters that are relevant, and that represent some type of emotion one way or the other.
Jeff Burnside, former fellow. Rhett, I'm with you. I'm the eternal optimist. And I also think that, and I've said this before, that we're entering a new golden age in environmental journalism. And I say that not because the salaries are getting better, but because these issues, I think, are finally taking root, no pun intended, with a broader percentage of society politically. And, you know, some non-journalists say it must be difficult under the Trump administration. He's bashing the environment. It's tough for environmental journalism. It's actually the opposite. There's more interest in our topics these days. And obviously, the science suggests that it's getting more of a problem every day with every new person born in the world. So that's why I'm an optimist. But you have the business model for being an optimist. And I'd like you to talk about why you think you're optimistic about this field, more specifically, and perhaps in terms of the business model and the journalism model that you've put together.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with you on the kind of the Trump bump that we've heard so much about. It's affected. It hasn't really affected Mongabay because we're more international, but a lot of environmental media outlets, reported on this huge increase in donations after the election. Why I'm optimistic is more about looking at looking at the size of the market and places we haven't essentially gone yet. And so it's just a very large market. We've only tapped a very small percentage of it. And then I also look at and this is getting kind of in the weeds, but I look at what Mongabay delivers relative to other organizations for funders. And I can make a pretty strong value proposition to funders in terms of the impact that Mongabay has. So funders view us in different ways. So, some just believe in general awareness raising. Some view us as kind of a due diligence mechanism. So if Mongabay is organically reporting on an area where their grantees are working, let's say like on climate, and some of their grantees are bubbling up through this organic reporting process, that's kind of like a validation. Okay, our groups are doing good work. If they're not bubbling up, it also raises questions. So are they bad at communication? Are they not doing good work? And other funders have viewed us as identifying gaps and opportunities. So Mongabay does a bunch of reporting on, elephants, and kind of the best organizations surface through that, and then the funders can then fund those projects. So I think, it's a combination of the size of the market and the value proposition, and also just kind of our trajectory so far, and our rate of expansion. So we just launched in India. I mean, India could easily be our biggest market a year from now in terms of readership. I mean, it's not yet, obviously, but you're talking about 1.3 billion people, especially if you go multilingual. So I just see a lot of opportunity out there. And I don't think Mongabay is unique. I think there's a lot of other journalism organizations that could, do very well by, telling their story better and looking beyond just the U.S. market.
Hey, I'm Alex Dudley. I contributed to the Asian Rhino series from Nepal 2 years ago as a correspondent, and last summer I contributed a commentary to the Indigenous People series based on my work with Grevy's zebra conservation in Kenya last summer. My question is related to the theme of optimism. So specifically what I'm wondering is, it seems like a challenge both for environmental journalists and conservation practitioners in engaging the public, making the public care, is that people are so overwhelmed with the bad news, everything that's going wrong, as has been alluded to tonight, that what we need are more reasons for optimism. I mean, case studies that may not be perfect, but overall do have promising results. Like, for instance, the rise of rhino numbers in Nepal, even though there are human rights issues associated with some of the methods. So I'm wondering, in the capacity of environmental reporting, how you address the challenge of countering the antipathy that can emerge when people are so exposed to bad news. So how do you present the landscape as it looks, but get people to feel like there is a difference that can be made?
Well, so I wrote a piece a few years ago about why I was optimistic for saving forests. And I preface the piece by saying that people regularly tell me that Mongabay is the most depressing site on the internet. So I'm an unusual person to be stating this, to writing this. But it is a good point. I mean, so one of the things that I want to do is launch a series looking at solutions. So we don't want to get into the obviously greenwashing, but solution stories tend to be a lot more difficult to tell than the problem stories. Because it's easy to poke holes in things. It's a lot harder to sort of construct a narrative about what's working. And if it's 80% working, you don't focus on 20% failure. I mean, you talk about what the problems are, but you focus, you tell the story of why it's working. And so I would like to scale up our reporting on this specifically to basically drive more correspondents to pitch these kind of stories to us. So by putting a carrot out there by saying this is a special reporting project, then we'll get more of those pitches. And so important in those stories is going for, you need facts obviously, but you also need to look for strong characters as you would with any good journalism, and things that are emotive. So get people to care about these things and get excited. So David versus Goliath sort of situations, and how these things are working. So I mean that's my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, it's something you have to balance with the optimism too, that you also have to be realistic, is some things are not pleasant, and some things, sometimes we can't just look at the bright side if you're not being realistic with what's happening. But I think that there's always a point that you can say, like, at least plant the seed for this is like the way that it could get better, or this is somebody, you choose somebody in the story who at least has some idea this is something that could be done. Maybe it's not being done, but it could be. So
I agree. I just say find characters that speak to that hopeful side, and also try to find those statistics if they exist. But if they don't exist, then just gotta write the story. Gotta work with what you got.
I think one of the things is looking for, like things that are of interest to multiple types of people. So
Yes.
you don't want to just preach to the choir.
Exactly.
You want to, find commonalities. So, things that all people, well, not all people, but most people can agree on. So maybe people don't believe in climate change, but they believe in, stewarding the earth or something like that. So looking for those kind of opportunities as well.
I'm Lindsay Fent. I'm a former fellow, and I've written for Mongabay a couple times about mostly murders of environmental defenders and like environmental crime. And those are beats I've covered for a long time, and Mongabay is one of basically the only outlets that I see that regularly covers those things. And so I'm kind of curious because other outlets publish your stories, when you approach them with kind of some of these things that you just don't see in the mainstream media, are people really excited to get those stories, or do you see some kind of like reticence to sort of publish some of those kind of more complex land use and narratives and stuff like that?
I mean, it's pretty variable. So in some countries, now outlets would shy away from something that's too controversial because they don't want to deal with it. All of our content is, available for anyone. So essentially people can just take it. Like they don't necessarily have to have a relationship with us. So we often don't hear why people take stuff. But I do think that the environmental defender stuff probably doesn't get as much pickup as like your fluffy panda story or your weird amphibian in the Amazon story, because it is more complex. And so unfortunately, I think that's the case. And I mean, in terms of like for fundraising, it's been really hard to raise money for that series. So it's often not been funded. We've just been kind of doing it, even though I couldn't find a funder. Yeah, so I think stories like that, and also like companies doing bad things, newspapers will also sometimes be afraid of publishing because they think they'll get sued or something. So unfortunately, that's we don't necessarily have that much feedback, and it seems like the uptake is not quite as great as you would hope on those kind of stories. But I know the Guardian takes a lot of our stories on that issue.
I wondered about if there's a difference between trying to show when there's individuals or when there's an organization, whether one or the other is better or more useful to cover. And I'm also sort of half thinking of whether sort of local or national. Like sometimes in my experience, there've been really good policies by local people in an organization like Sierra Club or Audubon early on with forests. But then at first the national is resistant and gradually the national becomes better or something. Anyway, so is your focus on trying to, or do you think it's more effective to, I'm partly motivated by thinking of Diane Wilson, who was this woman in Seadrift, Texas, who's written a couple of books, Diary of an Eco-Environmentalist or Terrorist. She's a shrimper, or was a shrimp from a shrimping family, and on Facebook every few days she takes pictures of the particles from Formosa Plastics and the oil companies, and she's chained herself to towers down there and formed lawsuits, on and on. But I mean, she just keeps going, both in Formosa and in Texas. There's like a one-woman campaign occasionally with another 20 or 30 people helping her.
Yeah, so I think part of it's, and this came up a lot in the session earlier today, was like topic versus story. So you could sort of apply this to groups versus individuals. So the group is the topic and the story is the individual. So you need it's often very useful to have a strong character to kind of drive the narrative. And so people connect with that character. So I think when you tell the story about an organization, it is often very useful to focus on an individual or like this movement. So focusing on the individual can be easier to get your hands around and tell a story around.
That's what I found. I found you got to start with the people. Even if you are covering an organization, there may be somebody in that organization who is louder, found creative ways to raise awareness, like this woman has, that will spark your attention or spark your interest or your imagination. If you have the benefit of time, spending time with multiple groups, members of that group, excuse me, and I guess also multiple groups who may be involved on a similar issue. Yeah, but I always like to start with characters first. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with what has been said.
Hi. I just have a question about your time frame when you guys are in country, kind of what you're prioritizing when you feel like you can like have enough time with your sources on a limited time frame. And I know this might be a hard question, and also like how much like flexibility you allow in your schedule. So if your story just takes you in a completely other direction, that you're able to do that.
I will start. I kind of come from it with a producer hat, and so I'm looking at always, am I covering all my pieces of my story, and then how deep, kind of like I build my bench, if you will, March Madness season, I don't know if anybody cares. I have a bench in each area of the story, so I want to make sure I have my experts. I want to make sure I have my good characters who are the activists or who are out here evangelizing for whatever issue it is, and then also find community members who are affected by this issue who may or may not also be activists. And then see how deep I can go on each of those kind of pools of people or pots of characters, if you will, and prioritize that way. And how many times can I go back? Usually, if I have enough time, I can go back to each of those bases again and again and again, and maybe find out something new each time that helps add to the pieces that I may have found along the way, going back around that way. There was another part to your question too about prioritizing time and.
Yeah, like how much flexibility, or if any flexibility, do you leave in your schedule?
Yeah, if you wherever the story takes you, you may have one idea. We were talking about this earlier in class. You may have one idea in your pitch, but when you get on the ground, it may not be, that may not be so, you know, and you have to really be flexible in terms of who you talk to, how how you set that up. Sometimes I've gone to ground where I've thought I had everything in order, I had all the characters lined up, and then either A, people got scared at the last minute and did not want to speak anymore for reasons of, maybe a big, if it was involving a big company or that was employing a lot of people in town, or if maybe they filed a lawsuit since I first started talking to them, so then they don't want to jeopardize whatever outcome of that lawsuit may be the case. So you always have to have a plan B, C, D.
I think it kind of depends on the story and what your time is. Sometimes you have more time, sometimes you have less time. But yeah, obviously the more time you can have, the better.
I mean, I don't really do much reporting anymore, so.
But you did.
Well, I mean, yeah, so I think it's just variable. I try to plan a lot out in advance, but then you also have to have contingency plans. So I just mentioned earlier today that I had this time where I went to China and I went through this long process of getting this permit, and then when I actually got out to the Tibetan Yunnan, the official literally spit on the permit and threw it on the ground and walked away. And so that was a bummer. So then I wrote a story about him spitting on my permit. Yeah. And then I snuck into the forest anyway. I didn't see the
There you
permits, but, yeah, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot of unpredictability in this space. But I try to lay things out and have some contingency plans.
Yeah.
But nothing usually doesn't go as you expect it.
No.
Yeah.
That's what you can plan for.
It's amazing how much you can get done when everything goes awry and suddenly you've got 18 hours to do a story you planned to have a week to do. You usually still get it done.
Yeah. So people sometimes ask me if I'm an adventurer, and my response is no. Adventure is what happens when things go wrong. Because I try to plan it. I'm not seeking adventure, but then adventure happens.
Then it becomes an adventure.
So, well, the last 4 questions, the questioners were able to pass the mic to one another. That, for me, is microphone bingo. I'm going to go collect my winnings. I really appreciate everybody coming out for this, and would appreciate everybody thanking our guests for finding time to visit us here in Boulder.